lighthouse. You are to light the lamps every evening at sunsetting and keep them constantly burning, bright and clear, till sunrising. This is the primary condition of a lighthouse keeper's duty. For this he lives, for this he toils, for this he watches, that the helpful flame which has been the salvation of so many lives may steadily glow and brightly burn from sunset until sunrise. Whatever else happens, remarks a lively writer, he is to do this. He may be isolated through the long night watches, 20 miles from land, 50 or 100 feet above the level of the sea, with the winds and waves howling round him, and the seabirds dashing themselves to death against the gleaming lantern, like giant moths against a candle. Or it may be a calm, voluptuous, moonlit night, the soft air laden with the perfumes of the Highland heather or the Cornish gorse, tempting him to keep his watch outside the lantern in the open gallery, instead of in the watchroom chair within. The channel may be full of stately ships, each guided by his light, or the horizon may be bare of all signs of life, except, remote and far beneath him, the lantern of some fishing boat at sea. But whatever may be going on outside, there is within for him the duty, simple and easy, by virtue of his moral method and orderly training, to light the lamps every evening at sunsetting, and to keep them constantly burning bright and clear till sunrising. That this great article of the lighthouse keeper's faith may be the more easily carried out, he is subjected both when on probation and afterwards to a strict discipline, and is required to gain a thorough acquaintance with all the materials he has to handle: lamps, oil, wicks, lighting apparatus, and revolving machinery. Before being admitted into the service, he gaze is within the circle of the outer gallery, or on the belt of rock surrounding the lighthouse base, and the sole incidents which break up the uniformity of his daily life are the inspections of the committee, the visits of the district superintendent, or the monthly relief which takes the men back to shore. In the shore lighthouse, as at Harwich or the Forelands, there is a plot of ground to cultivate, frequent intercourse with visitors from the neighbouring watering places, and the wider range of occupation and entertainment which necessarily can be enjoyed upon terra firma. As a rule, the public take but little interest in the economy of our lighthouses, and yet there is something singularly romantic in the idea of the lone tower encircled by boiling waters, with its warning light flashing through the deep night shadows, and the heroic men who hour after hour watch with anxious care lest its radiance should be obscured or extinguished. And as the evening darkens low, how bright, through the deep purple of the twilight air, beams forth the sudden radiance of its light, with strange unearthly splendour in its glare. Not one alone, from each projecting cape and perilous reef along the ocean's verge, starts into life a dim gigantic shape, holding its lantern the restless surge. Like the great giant Christopher it stands upon the brink of the tempestuous wave, wading far out among the rocks and sands, the night o'ertaken mariner to save, and the great ships sail outward and return, bending and bowing o'er the billowy swells, and ever joyful as they see it burn, they wave their silent welcomes and farewells. They come forth from the darkness, and their sails gleam for a moment only in the blaze, and eager faces as the light unveils gaze at the tower and vanish while they gaze. The mariner remembers when a child, on his first voyage, he saw it fade and sink, and when returning from adventures wild, he saw it rise again o'er the ocean's brink. Steadfast, serene, immovable, the same year after year through all the silent night, burns on for evermore that quenchless flame, shines on that inextinguishable light. Sail on, it says, sail on, ye stately ships, and with your floating bridge the Grace Darling resolved to assist him on his noble errand. She sprang into the skiff, and over the pounding billows, father and daughter gallantly made their way. Their lives hung upon a thread, but the weak girl never bated a jot of heart or hope, and rode with all the vigour which a noble enthusiasm is apt to inspire. They reached the ship and took off 9 persons, with whom they contrived to regain the lighthouse. 9 more escaped in one of the steamer's boats. All the rest perished. Grace Darling did not live many years after the event which made her famous. She was interred in the old chapel on Holy Island, and an epitaph to her memory composed by the poet Wordsworth reads, "The maiden gentle yet at duty's call, firm and unflinching as the lighthouse reared, on the island rock her lonely dwelling place, or like the invisible rock itself, that braves age after age the hostile elements, as when it guarded holy Cuthbert's cell." Smeaton speaks of a shoemaker who entered the Eddystone lighthouse because he longed for a solitary life. He found himself less a prisoner on his wave-beaten rock than in his close and confined workshop. When some of his friends expressed their astonishment at his choice, "Each to his taste," said he, "I have always been partial to independence." Perhaps it was the same individual who, after having served at the Eddystone upwards of 14 years, conceived so strong an attachment to his prison that for 2 consecutive years he gave up his term of relief. He would fain have continued the same course of life for a 3rd year, but so much pressure was brought to bear upon him that he consented to avail himself of the usual privilege. All the years he had spent in the lighthouse he had been distinguished for his quiet and orderly behaviour. On land he found himself out of his element, and drank until he was completely intoxicated. In this condition he was carried back to the Eddystone, where, after languishing for a few days, he expired. Some men have gone mad, or nearly so, by dint of contemplating the same scenes and the same external impressions. About 1.25 miles from the Land's End, on a group of granite islets washed by the sea, stands the Long Ship's lighthouse, constructed in 1793. The particular rock on which it is built, the Carn Brass, rises about 45 feet above the level of low water. In winter, both the rock and the building, as is the case at the Eddystone, will sometimes be covered for a few seconds by the leaping waters, which have even been known to surmount the lantern, and on one occasion at least, to break through its crystal walls and extinguish the lamps. One day in 1862, 2 black flags floated from the summit of the tower. They were evidently intended as a signal of distress. What then had happened? Of the 3 men who inhabited the lighthouse, the one whose turn it was to keep watch had thrust a knife into his breast. His companions attempted to stanch the blood by plugging up the wound with bits of tow. less rigid than that of soldiers. In France, indeed, veteran soldiers or tried seamen are generally selected to fill up any vacancies that may occur in the lighthouse administration. This is divided into two classes: the inspectors, who receive 1,000 francs yearly, about £40, and are instructed with the superintendents of several lighthouses, and the keepers, who are divided into 6 classes, and whose annual wages from 475 to 850 francs, say 18 to 34 pounds. Extra payment is awarded to those who serve in the sea lighthouses. Their number is never less than 3 in a lighthouse of the first class, or 2 in those of the second and third class lighthouses. The code, so to speak, from which we borrow these details, is nearly the same among all maritime nations. It indicates to the keepers their duties and prescribes to them the nature of their daily work. As for their mode of life, it is much the same everywhere, only more or less agreeable according to the stations. In France, the lighthouses served by a single keeper are entrusted to married men who live in the establishment with their family. Not only does such an arrangement ameliorate their lot, but it also gives the assurance that in case of need, they will immediately be replaced in attendance on the lamp, a task so easy that it can be discharged by a woman or even by a child. The habitation allotted to them consists of 1 or 2 apartments, with a chimney, an outhouse, and sometimes a cellar. A green and a small garden are invariably attached. In some lighthouses, the keeper's house is so placed with reference to the tower that the lamp is visible from one of the windows, but in most, the house is annexed to the tower in such a manner that if the keeper is compelled to rise and attend to the lamp, at least he is not exposed immediately after leaving his couch to the rigour it may be of a winter night. In lenticular lights of the first, second, and third class, whose flame requires surveillance throughout the night, several keepers are needed, who take their watch in turn. Formerly, the keepers and their families lodged together. But unfortunately, those dissensions which seem inevitable when a colony is numerous, and not amenable to a strict discipline, were found to break out at very short intervals, and in an exceedingly disagreeable manner. The authorities, therefore, resolved only to admit their own servants into the interior of the lighthouses, leaving to them, if married, the care of securing suitable lodgings for their wives and children. To each keeper a room was allotted, and the kitchen was common to all. The result they had in view was thus obtained, but it was soon perceived that to separate the keepers from their families was to impose a heavy tax upon men whose pay was not too liberal, that to deprive them of the sweet domestic joys which are the legitimate reward of the cares and anxieties of paternity, was to increase the gloominess of their isolation by rendering it more complete, and finally to expose them to the strong temptation of absenting themselves from the lighthouse at the hours their presence was most necessary. These inconveniences have been remedied by allotting to each keeper a separate house for himself and his family. It is of course impossible that a keeper's family should be accommodated in a sea lighthouse which consists of a single tower. They are therefore lodged on shore, near the port which keeps up the communication between the lighthouse and the mainland. In such a station life amuse themselves with fishing. If their abode is not encircled by rocks on which they can stretch their lines, they knot around the lighthouse tower at a certain height